And assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
Whatever it is, you try and channel it to
You will see a position of deny what they think is false, argue what they think is false. You have to have free and uncorrupted communication.
Thank you very much. First, I wanted to explain, I'll go through the different reasons why I wrote the book and a little bit about the region. First, I want to explain the title because I think sometimes it sort of gives a wrong impression, perhaps. It's called I is for Infidel, and I chose it because during the 1980s, when the former Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan and the Mujahideen were in power, the U.S. was supporting the Mujahideen, the guerrilla warriors against the Soviet Union. And at the time, there was books prepared by the U.S., a U.S. university, in fact, for Afghan refugees in Pakistan, and the books were prepared to teach the children how to teach the children English, and so the material was circulated, and again at that time the U.S. was really pushing the Islamic fervor or the religious fervor to encourage the fighting against the communists, who were then being portrayed as the godless communists, and here were the guerrillas to fight against them, these religious-minded people. Anyway, so the title comes from a program to teach the young refugees English, and prepared by a U.S. university, and it was I is for Infidel, J is for Jihad, and K is for Kalashnikov. And then they would have, questions for the students, math questions. If you have 30 communists and you kill 20 communists, how many communists would you have left? And that was the material that was circulated for the Afghan refugees back in the 1980s. And the idea behind the story was to sort of show that here we are now in post-Taliban period, and again, educational material is being used and it's being circulated to the Afghans. But again, the theme, of course, has changed, and today it's D is for democracy. And so it just was a try to show the differing approaches at different times depending on the need of the hour. I wanted to talk to you about a little bit about the history, but also to try and give you an understanding of contemporary Afghanistan and contemporary Pakistan, and who some of the people are that are in power today and making decisions today in Afghanistan, and people who are in power and making decisions today in Pakistan. First, Afghanistan, and I think it should be understood that, or one of the reasons, maybe I should start this way, is to explain to you why I decided to write this book. I've been in the region for a long time, and people were often saying to me, gee, Kathy, why don't you write a book on Afghanistan and Pakistan? You know, people come in for a couple of months and then they write a book. And I always thought, I don't want to keep repeating information that's already out there and just regurgitate old information. And after September 11th, I really was struck by the amount of misinformation that was out there about a region that I had covered for a long time and knew fairly well. And what really struck me too was how the information kept being repeated and repeated and repeated until suddenly lies became truths. And the more we repeated them, the more we began to accept them as truths. And I was struck also by how history seemed to be repeating itself, and how allies that had been problematic in the past were again returning to be allies, and how the peoples of the region, whether Afghans or Pakistanis, would eventually again probably pay the price, and maybe the larger region and maybe even beyond that. one of the things that, first maybe to go through some of the myths or the misinformation that was out there post-September 11th that was wrong and was being presented as fact. For example, the CIA went on at great length explaining how the Taliban had brought Osama bin Laden to Afghanistan back in 1996 when Sudan forced Osama bin Laden to leave Afghanistan because of sanctions and because of demands by the US that he be expelled from Sudan. At that time, Osama looked around for a place to go, and he looked to Afghanistan, and there was a group of people who said at the time that he would be welcome. Well, those people were not the Taliban, because the Taliban at that time were not in power in Afghanistan, but the people who actually went to Sudan, to Khartoum, and said to Osama, yes, you are welcome to come to Afghanistan, and yes, we will protect you, was the very Mujahideen government that was embraced post-September 11th to hunt down the Taliban remnants and Osama bin Laden. They were people like Abdul Rasul Sayyaf. They were people like Haji Qadir, who was a minister in Hamid Karzai's first government. These were the people who said to Osama bin Laden, you are welcome to come to Afghanistan. And yes, and Osama at the time said to them, listen, you know, Sudan has gotten problems from the Americans because they want me out of here. And so he said, you know, this might happen to you guys, you know, are you prepared to accept that? And they had a meeting and they all got together and said, yes, you know, 20 years of war, we've got lots of problems, you know, one more, you're a good Muslim, sure, come on in. And so they welcomed him into Afghanistan. And Richard Clark, the CIA chief who had gone on at great length about how George Bush's administration had ignored warnings pre-September 11th to possibilities of attacks here in the United States. In his book, he said that the Taliban brought Osama bin Laden to Afghanistan, and that Mullah Omar wanted Osama bin Laden to come to Afghanistan so that he could finance the training camps in Afghanistan. Both facts were wrong, and policy based on those facts, wrong facts, led the U.S. and its coalition partners to embrace the very people that had in fact brought Osama bin Laden to Afghanistan back in 1996. In fact, Mullah Omar didn't even know Osama prior to this, because Mullah Omar was mostly stayed around Kandahar, Arghandab, nearby. And Osama, that was quite a well-known fact, had not before or during the Soviet invasion, when he did fight in Afghanistan, he didn't go down to Kandahar. He had spent his time in eastern Afghanistan, Paktia Paktika, in around Tora Bora, where that big battle was in December 2001. So that was wrong information. But because the Taliban had been so demonized that it became acceptable to say anything and attribute it to the Taliban. And I don't say for a moment that the Taliban weren't a regressive force. But another reason why I decided that I wanted to write this book was to sort of, there was a real sense that the world had really been divided into a very black and white way of looking at things. The nuances, the gray of most issues had been lost, and the Taliban, albeit a very regressive movement, I guess I just got so tired of hearing, well, at least the Taliban are gone, and yet paying no mind to the people that were returned to power in Afghanistan, people who, when they had last been in power between 1992 and 1996, had in fact their fighting, and really bitter fighting, because I was there, resulted in the deaths of 50,000 Afghans. I remember during that time being at the AP house. We had a house there and have had for the whole time. And inside of it, I was in the basement, because then you spent a lot of time in the basement. Counting within 2 minutes, I counted 100 incoming and outgoing rockets. That's a huge amount, a huge amount. And that was the different factions outside of Kabul and the factions within Kabul, who later, post-Taliban, were portrayed as heroes. People like Saif again and his people. And while the Taliban, for sure, were very regressive in their treatment of women, many of the people today in power in Afghanistan were also very regressive and committed atrocities against minorities and against women. And I remember going to an area of Kabul after a particularly bitter battle between ethnic Hazaras and Saif's people, his men. And an old man came up to me, and he had in a shawl, he had all this hair, it was all bloodied, and he threw it at me. And he was really upset, obviously, and was screaming, and brought me into a place where there were 5 women, all of whom had been scalped and killed, and that was by Saif's people. And after the Taliban, because the Taliban had been so demonized, and I don't for a moment suggest that they were not regressive people, but the Taliban movement actually began as a response to the anarchy that had been created by these mujahideen groups. And the reason it's so important to understand that is because if you don't understand what went on in the past, you don't understand where it is today in Afghanistan. And because it was ignored post-Taliban who these people were, or post-September 11th, who these people were, they have been allowed to return to positions of power in Afghanistan, which is really, for ordinary Afghans, a serious concern. But during the time when they were in power, because of the anarchy, it actually gave rise to the Taliban. And at the outset of the Taliban, and my book sort of explains where the Taliban began, and it really does give an insider's view, because it's from one of the actual founders of the Taliban, who I have quoted in the book and who I've known since 1999, when the Taliban were very strong. And he was the Deputy Interior Minister, and at one point he was the Intelligence Minister of the Taliban, which is a very powerful position. I knew him when, and I say this because it's very easy post-Taliban to say, well, yeah, for sure he's going to say that. I mean, who wouldn't? He wants to save his skin. Of course he's going to say I was a great guy. But I knew him back in 1999 when the Taliban were very strong, when there was no danger that the Taliban were going to be overthrown. It was way ahead of September 11th. So I'm just putting my watch here because I've been told I can only speak for so long, so I want to make sure I don't... So this Taliban minister, he told me how the very beginnings of the Taliban, and in fact, people like Hamid Karzai, who I've known since for 16 years, so I've known him for quite some time, and I remember having discussions with him when the Taliban first began, and saying, but you know, these guys are so regressive, a bunch of, you know, village mullahs, and he said, you don't understand, Kathy. He says that these guys, there is such lawlessness, there is such anarchy. These guys are not interested in power, they just want to clean up things. And when they first began, that really was how it began. Mullah, the nucleus of the Taliban, which was this bunch of religious leaders, or when they weren't religious, they were village mullahs. Mullah Omar's, I've been to his school that he ran, was just like one room, a fraction of this size, made of mud. But all the people who began the Taliban had actually returned home after the Mujahideen government took power in 1992, and the pro-Moscow government was gone, and the pro-Moscow president, Najibullah, was living in the UN compound under UN protection, but was no longer in power, and the people in power were the Mujahideen government, the very guerrillas who had been fighting the Soviets, and now they'd won, and now they were in power. And all these people who began the Taliban, they had gone home and to return to their village. They had fought against the Soviets. Okay, it was all over, they went home. The anarchy, within 4 years, the well, not even within 4 years, within 2 or 3 years, as soon as the Mujahideen government got into power, everybody, all these small commanders kind of divided the country up among themselves. And so you would go 10 kilometers, somebody would charge you a fine. You go another 10 kilometers, somebody else would stop you and charge you, some money. We had our sat phone stolen 3 times, on the road between the Pakistani border and Jalalabad. So it was really lawless. I remember in Kandahar one day, 42 or 45 people being killed in a single day. Just gun battles would break out. There was a UN convoy was stolen. It was really anarchic. And that really was the genesis of the Taliban. They then reemerged because to really basically clear a stretch of road between Malomar's village and Kandahar, and it wasn't more than about 30, 40 kilometer stretch of road. But there were so many checkposts where you had to pay a toll. Anyway, they got together, they decided they would take out this one checkpost. Checkpost fell like that. The commanders just dropped their weapons. These guys took the weapons. They thought, oh, that wasn't so bad. They went on to the next checkpost. And that one fell like that. And it went on right until they got to Kandahar. And Kandahar itself, just sort of the commanders who were in control in Kandahar just kind of slipped away, and these guys took control of the city. And that was their first experience with having really actually controlled a seat of government or a city. And at the beginning, they really were a response to the anarchy. It didn't take long before Pakistan got involved. And Pakistan got involved not to create the Taliban, as people say today, not to extend its influence initially, as people say today. Pakistan got involved because initially they had a convoy going up to Central Asia, and it got stolen by these Mujahideen commanders. And so the person who was in charge, in fact, it was Benazir Bhutto's government that initially supported the Taliban. It was her interior minister who said to these mullahs, oh, you did such a good job of clearing up the road, could you do something and see if you can't get that convoy back? And sure enough, they got the convoy back. And at that time, there was a Pakistani colonel who was heading this security for this convoy, saw the potential in this group of ethnic Pashtuns, which is the majority ethnic group in Afghanistan. After that, they did gain control. Slowly, they sent in a lot of young lads from the religious schools in Pakistan, Afghans, Pakistanis. Malomar, at the time, he would have taken anybody who said, yes, I'm here to fight on behalf of Islam. They said, oh, okay, that's great, come in. So they slowly, the founders of the Taliban were slowly sidelined by men who had trained at religious schools in Pakistan and were controlled by the Pakistani intelligence. And they gradually insinuated themselves into Mullah Omar's circle. And those who had actually begun the Taliban, a group of about 60 mullahs, gradually were sidelined and they were sort of pushed out. And as the Taliban progressed and they gained more control over the country, Pakistan gained more and more influence over the Taliban. But until they actually took control of Kabul in September of 1996, Osama bin Laden and his Arab fighters were actually on the side of the Mujahideen. And the training camps in Afghanistan that ran unhindered between 1992 and 96 were run under the Mujahideen government. And Ayman al-Zawahiri, who is the man who is most often seen on the videos condemning everybody, in fact was a very close ally of Saif, who was very prominent in the Mujahideen government and very prominent today in Afghanistan, and a frequent visitor to the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. Zawahiri was a very close ally of Saif's, and he lived in Afghanistan between 1992 and 96 unhindered, despite the fact that he was wanted in absentia. He was found guilty, rather, in absentia of the assassination of Anwar Sadat and sentenced to death. He was protected by the Mujahideen government. President Rabbani, who is back in Afghanistan today, supported by the U.S., and whose government retained the seat at the UN throughout the Taliban time, in fact gave 600 and some Afghan passports to many Arab fighters who are members of Al-Qaeda, and including Ayman al-Zawahiri. So it's a real of interest not just to Pakistanis and Afghans, but also to the larger world, that many of the very people who are very influential in Afghanistan today are those same people who were very strongly allied to Osama and Al-Qaeda, and not, in fact, the Taliban. The Taliban, however, as they did progress through the country, when they took power in 1996, Osama bin Laden did make overtures. He and many of the Arab fighters initially stepped away because they had been fighting on the side of some of the Mujahideen groups who were fighting the Taliban. So they were a little nervous, didn't know how they would be welcomed. Osama went through several intermediaries and made contact with Mullah Omar. And Mullah Omar welcomed him, because he welcomed anybody who said he was a good Muslim. And he ordered him, though, down to Kandahar. Gradually, as Pakistan had gained control of the Taliban, Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda gradually gained control of the Taliban. As the world sort of stepped back and labeled them demons and had nothing to do with them, it sidelined the more reasonable voices within the Taliban, and there were, but the Taliban wasn't a unit of a unified group. There were different voices. But in Afghanistan, strength is important. Strength is what people will follow, and the more moderate voices weren't able to come forward because people realized that nobody would support them. There was a massacre of Taliban in 1997 in Mazar-e-Sharif. There were like 2,000 of them were killed. The UN knew about it, people knew about it, nothing was done. The next year, horribly, the Taliban turned around and massacred 1,000 people in Mazar-e-Sharif. The world was outraged. That further reinforced the feeling among the people, the Taliban, that if you went against Mullah Omar, you couldn't expect any kind of support. So even the more moderate voices within the Taliban, and certainly not progressive by our standard, but there were opportunities to work with, to give strength to those moderate voices. And I know because even before 2001, September 2001, talking to this Deputy Interior Minister in March when the Buddha statues were destroyed. And there was no reason, again, for him to say any of this to me because the Taliban were very strong. And he was trying at the council, the Taliban council, the shura that ran the show for the Taliban and who made the decisions, where the decisions were made, he was trying to convince them not to destroy the Buddhas. And he said, it would be better that you cut the throat of my son than you destroy those statues because they're our heritage. But he couldn't gain any support because there was no sense among the Taliban that if you joined to oppose Mullah Omar, that you would have any support. And Mullah Omar, meanwhile, and the defense minister and the intelligence minister, which now controlled the Taliban, had the full support of the Pakistanis and Osama bin Laden and the Arabs, which were the backbone of the fighting force now against the Northern Alliance. So it really, there were opportunities, and I say this not that the Taliban were not regressive and that people weren't happy to see the back of them, but as they were had taken over, there were opportunities to strengthen the more moderate voices, but because of such a overriding sense of outrage at their treatment of women, I guess, but that being said, as the Taliban were gaining in strength, no one was particularly concerned about the treatment of women. The United Nations, I remember talking to a UN official saying, why do you send the female employees home when the Taliban tell you to? And this UN person who was negotiating with the Taliban at the time, before the Taliban took power, he says, don't you talk to me about women. He said, I didn't even mention women to the Taliban, because that's a cultural thing. That's tradition. That has nothing to do. I'm trying to get a peace agreement here. So he didn't, the subject wasn't even brought up to the Taliban until after they took power. And I remember at the front lines talking to different Taliban leaders and asking them, you know, at the end of every interview, I'd always bring up so I don't understand, what is this about sending women home all the time? And half the time they would say to me, I don't know why you keep talking about women. We never hear this from the United Nations. And it's true, there was no outrage, there was no concern about how they treated women prior to their takeover of Kabul, as they had taken over in different cities. And that only occurred after Najibullah, the communist president, was hung by several Taliban who were the initial people to come into Kabul. When they took Najib and they hung him, it was by people who had been fighting during the Soviet invasion, by people who had lost many of their family members. A horrific thing to do, but at the time, Najibullah to them was embodied everything that had been horrific about the Soviet invasion when 1 million people had died. So they hung Najib, and then the world turned on them very quickly, and they quickly were, as the years progressed, turned into a pariah movement, which in fact sidelined any potential for dealing with moderates within that movement. And it gave strength to the Pakistani military that was controlling them, and gave strength to Osama and to the Al-Qaeda movement, because they were the only ones to embrace the Taliban and to give strength to them, and any of the more moderate-minded had no opportunity to encourage a following, because nobody was prepared to take a chance. And then September 11th, of course, happened. And at September 11th, for sure the majority of, and I don't think any of the Taliban leaders knew what was happening. I think that bin Laden knew full well back in March with the whole Buddha destruction, and that was a real show of the real stranglehold that Al-Qaeda then had on the Taliban. And by totally horrifying the world, it really, and it really made it impossible for Malomar post-September 11th to hand over Osama. And I think that was probably Osama's thinking at the time. Malomar, I'm sure, probably had no idea what was going on, because he would hardly even know where New York is, let alone the World Trade Center building. So as you look at it, you see how the manipulation occurred and the potentials that were there to stop, to change the course. But because of our inability to look at anything with any sense of nuance or the gray, we just totally rejected and turned them into total evildoers, despite the fact that any of their behavior was being committed equally in other countries, and certainly countries that are our allies. And then to embrace the very people who then brought in Osama post-September 11th is to undermine the potential for stability in the country post-September 11th. And then to add salt to the wound, to embrace the Pakistani military post-September 11th, was to, in the intervening 4 years since September 11th, really undermine the Pakistani civil society. And to see Pakistan in these 4 years go to where it now today has the religious right in control of 2 provinces and is the official opposition. When Pakistanis have voted in the past, when the religious parties have been participating in elections, they have never given more than 9 to 10% of the vote to the religious parties. Under the military, under General Musharraf, the religious parties first were, the elections were held in 2002, so it was after September 11th, is when Musharraf was an ally. He allowed the religious right to take control of the two provinces, but in a number of ways. He said that anybody running in the elections had to have a university degree. Okay, so that put out a lot of people. However, he said then, but if you have a degree from the madrasas or the religious schools, then that's equivalent to a university degree. Well, suddenly, you know, I mean, the political parties like the PPP or the Muslim League, they would have farmers or whatever who were members, but of course they didn't have university degrees. Anyway, they were all sidelined. But a lot of these very radical mullahs were suddenly enabled to run in elections, and sometimes they were the only ones running in certain constituencies because the other ones, the mainstream parties, had been sidelined. At the end of the elections, lo and behold, the religious right has control of two provinces and is the official opposition. Meanwhile, General Musharraf is saying what an ally he is, and really he's talking about enlightened Islam in Pakistan, while handing over to some of the more regressive and truly regressive elements a huge amount of the country. The same thing happened during the 1980s when the U.S. allied itself with General Zia-ul-Haq, who at that time brought in madrasa system to a huge extent in Pakistan, who introduced regressive legislation which haunts Pakistanis today. And during the 1980s, every year the U.S. president signed off that Pakistan was not developing a nuclear weapon. It was the U.S. president had to sign off because the legislation, it required an annual signature of the U.S. president saying, no, Pakistan does not have a nuclear weapon. The Soviets pulled out in 1989. In 1990, the United States cut off all military and humanitarian aid to Pakistan and says, oh, Pakistan has a nuclear weapon and so you're now cut off from all aid, which turned the military against, not against the U.S., but it certainly said to the military, you know, you have to watch with a very critical eye what the U.S. says. That same military is who is allied today to the U.S., and they don't see the United States as an honest partner. The U.S. shouldn't be seeing the Pakistani military as an honest partner, but they're both hedging their bets, and certainly the Pakistani military is hedging its bet and has very strong ties to the religious right, and has, in its time and power, really undermined the Pakistani civil society, which is the ticket to any kind of stability in the region, but which is sorely undermined to the point where General Musharraf can come to the United States just last month and say, you know, Pakistani women are crying rape just so they get visas to the United States. He can hold the passport of a woman who was brutally raped and condemned to this by a local shura and withhold her passport from coming to the United States because he didn't want to hurt the image of Pakistan. This is the Pakistani military that has infiltrated the educational institutions in Pakistan, who today, under the guise of modernizing madrasas, really is going to make the madrasa system, which is mostly religious education and 0 through to grade 10, the mainstream form of education in Pakistan, which is a real disservice to Pakistanis who have not embraced that as a system. There is no public education in Pakistan, but because the military is the ally, because the military is being held up as the ticket to democracy in Pakistan, the military is allowed to have a free hand. Pakistanis will pay the price for that, just as Afghans will pay the price of the Northern Alliance being put into power and warlords being in control. As the West steps away, which it will, not as much as it did back in 1992, but it certainly will, and it already is talking about it, and it already has moved away to a certain extent. So at the end of the day, the price will be paid by the Pakistanis and by the Afghans. Possibly the larger world community, then the interest will come back again. But it just is so evident the repetition of mistakes made in the past and the seeming lack of learning from past mistakes that has resulted in today Pakistan being largely controlled by the military. It's not like Turkey, and the Turkish model is not to be compared to Pakistan because the Turkish military is also a secular military and has been the sort of the protector of a secular civilian administration. The Pakistani military, since its inception in Pakistan in 1947, has been aligned to the religious right. So it's a very, very different example, and so shouldn't be confused with the two, which is often what is done. Comparing the two, and because the mistakes or the history is repeating itself, the dangers are also repeating themselves. And I think part of the reason for this, and I'll wind up with this, is that from the very outset, there really wasn't a commitment to the region after September 11th, despite the rhetoric. And the rhetoric, I have to say, that Afghans did in fact believe, but in fact really was largely rhetoric. And there are a number of reasons why I'll say that. First, in terms of assistance to Afghanistan post September 11th. CARE International did a survey that showed that per capita, Afghanistan received $50 per capita in assistance compared to in Kosovo, post-war in Kosovo, where the assistance there was $500 per capita. So just in terms of just assistance, the commitment was limited. In terms of the resources put on the ground, in terms of soldiers, and it was very, very limited. And I remember talking to people in the defense attaché's office at the U.S. Embassy at the time, who were really surprised at the few numbers of soldiers that were on the ground in Afghanistan on October 7th and then afterward. And they were surprised. And in hindsight, they say, of course, because there was already in the planning was Iraq and the larger number of soldiers were required. But because it was necessary to husband those resources for the conflict in Iraq, the decision was made then to farm out the job of hunting down al-Qaeda, of bringing a government to Afghanistan, and it was given to the very people who had been anarchic when they were last in power and who had in fact brought in Osama bin Laden to Afghanistan. And because Pakistan, there wasn't an interest or an involvement in such a degree to be able to identify civil partners, to be able to identify the trouble spots within the Pakistani military and the intelligence. My goodness, after September 11th, the person who was given the job of convincing Mullah Omar to hand over Osama bin Laden was the ISI chief, the Pakistani intelligence chief, who in fact went to Kandahar and said to Mullah Omar, don't hand over Osama, we'll tell you what's going to happen, we'll give you some idea here and there what's going to, you know, what kind of strategy they have, don't give in, you know, you're a good Muslim, no. This was the person who was given the job of going to Afghanistan. And I know this from people who were at the same meetings in Kandahar, given the job of actually trying to convince the Mullah Omar to hand him over. So the results of repeating history, I mean, the fact that history is repeating itself is what struck me to a great extent to write the book, and the misinformation and myths that were really being repeated and being presented as truths, and also a real worry or sense that in the end it'll be the Pakistanis and the Afghans who will pay the price, and the Afghans who really believed the rhetoric when it was given, and they accepted, okay, you bring back these people, but the international community was with them, and they wouldn't let the same things happen again, and in fact the same situations are happening again, and the people who will pay the price initially anyway will be the Afghans and the Pakistanis, and that was also another reason for writing this book. And Now I see that my time is just about up. And if there are any questions, I'll be glad to take any questions at all on either countries. Thank you. I will start here with the gentleman.
Thank you so much. Wonderful history. Do you have any idea how to fix any of this?
No. Well, I mean, I think some very tough decisions have to be made. I think that Hamid Karzai, as president of Afghanistan, has not taken some very tough decisions. He didn't take the decisions. And the U.S. Special Envoy to Afghanistan, who was very much a part of making the policy that embraced the very people who brought Osama to Afghanistan, the policy that alienated an entire ethnic group and caused a resurgence of the Taliban. These decisions Hamid Karzai has to make. He has to make the decision to send out a message that people will be held accountable. But that those people who have committed atrocities will be held accountable. No, you can't take into account everyone. You can't change it overnight. But certainly, you can send a message that it's not business as usual. But in fact, the message that he has sent out has been that, in fact, it is business as usual in Afghanistan. And that's the problem. And so, yes, I mean, it's not an easy solution, obviously, and it takes years. But the beginnings, the foundations have to begin to be laid. And that requires some tough decisions to be made, and they haven't been made yet.
Anything the U.S. can do?
Well, I mean, the support, it was Zalmay Khalilzad, who is now the U.S. Special Envoy to Iraq, that encouraged that whole policy that alienated the entire Pashtun ethnic group. There has to be support for those decisions. It can't be, but that requires a commitment, because if there is a problem when those decisions are made, the Afghanistan needs some assistance. But if they're not going to receive assistance, then it's very difficult for Karzai to make those decisions. That's not to let him off the hook, because frankly he hasn't taken a leadership position and he hasn't made those decisions. But that being said, he also hasn't had the support for those decisions from the U.S. administration.
I've spoken with Afghan natives and also done a bit of reading about the Western education system that's being brought to Afghanistan and the benefits in teaching young people, especially boys and girls, a different set of values and teaching them skills that will help them in their future to change their nation from the inside rather than trying to change it through military force. And I understand that's the current strategy. Have you seen the education system in Kabul and the benefits there for the young people? Free radio and the like? Sure.
In fact, it's at the very, very beginning. I mean, in fact, there isn't a... the Afghan value system is very good. I mean, their value system is not to change their value system, and it's not to bring a new value system, I don't think. I mean, I think most Afghans, if you were to ask them, would be very proud of their value system. For sure, there is attention on education now, particularly for both girls and boys. It's at the very, very beginning, because first it's only in Kabul and in the cities, sorry, not just in Kabul, but in the cities. It really hasn't made it into the rural areas. There's a real lack of teacher training, there's a real lack of material, there's a real lack of facilities, there's a real lack of a lot of things. So it's really at the very beginnings. There isn't a standard curriculum, although there is an attempt to develop a standard curriculum. It hasn't been established yet, so that's still at the very beginning. So yes, while there is a realization, it still remains to be seen what direction it's going in and how effective it is. But certainly it's the beginning.
I'm hoping for the best there.
Sure, as are Afghans.
Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you for being here, and I'm amazed at how much courage it must take to live in Afghanistan and the places that you...
None. I love Afghanistan and Pakistan. It doesn't take any courage at all.
I don't
No, it's
believe
true.
that.
I mean, not to say that there hasn't been dangerous times, but certainly not from the people of either country.
Well, thanks again. I wanted to ask you a couple of things. One, on a less happy note, from this speech, one could actually glean that you're almost an apologist for the Taliban. That's the first thing. And I'm not saying that is true. I'm just saying that's a devil's advocate position. And two, if you would, it's my understanding that Hamid Karzai was a former executive of Bechtel and linked to oil. And
A former executive of who? Of where? Of Unical?
Of Unical, Unical. I may be wrong. I'm probably saying a number of things that are incorrect. But he has connections to oil. And would you comment, if you will, my understanding is that Afghanistan is surrounded by a number of countries with oil, and that it may be the only friendly place for the United States to install a permanent pipeline coming through as a conduit to getting oil out of Kazakhstan or Belarus or other countries, whereas we may not have that access, which may support the notion that the Afghanistan war wasn't so much about replacing the Taliban or the whole thing about you're either on my side or you're not on the United States side, but it's really, once again, about this oil conspiracy.
Sure. First, I'll tackle the Taliban apologist. I've certainly heard that before, but that being said, I'm not, because people are happy to see the back of the Taliban. My intention is to say that by demonizing the Taliban, opportunities were squandered. Opportunities were lost. I don't know whether September 11th could have been avoided, but opportunities were lost, and that affected the Afghan people. And by looking at them strictly as evil, which was what was done, opportunities were lost. And so by trying to inject a bit of gray into the situation, when in fact there was a lot of gray, I realize that that I am a Taliban apologist, but in fact, all I'm saying is that you have to look at whether it's a Taliban or you have to look at it in a much broader sense and try and see, is there anyone within that organization or movement or government that can be worked with, and try and understand a little bit more other than to just say, oh, that's evil and we're not going to deal with it. On Hamid Karzai and oil, that's also gone around. That is the oil pipeline from Turkmenistan. There was Unical and Bridas, both going after that. Unical, I think, pumped in something like $500 and some million. Bob Oakley, who was a former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Pakistan, was also involved in trying to lobby the Taliban. Hamid Karzai wasn't chosen because of any oil conspiracy, as far as I know. I mean, frankly, Hamid Karzai wasn't even the first choice for president of Afghanistan. As my understanding, the first choice was a person named Abdul Haq, who was actually sent into Afghanistan after September 11th and before October 7th. No, maybe it was after October 7th, after the bombing started. Anyway, he didn't realize, he hadn't been in a while. Anyway, he was found out, he was killed, and he really, I do believe, was the first choice. They were looking for a Pashtun. They needed to have a Pashtun in. Hamid Karzai's name was brought up. The administration, the current administration, was not particularly familiar with Hamid Karzai at all. And so I don't see it as an oil conspiracy. The pipeline now that is, and because Turkmenistan was a pipeline, the Turkmenistan government is a hugely difficult one. They kept changing. Yes, you can have it. No, you couldn't. The pipeline really that is being sought and looked at now is Iran, Pakistan, India, coming from Iran, not obviously to feed U.S. needs, nor was the Turkmenistan pipeline initiated or thought of to feed U.S. needs. It was to run through Afghanistan to Pakistan and on to India.
Thank you.
Good evening. Do the Afghanistanis, I guess I say, or the Pakistanis that you spoke of, either Mujahideen or Taliban or military on the Pakistani side, care what happened on September 11th at the World Trade Center?
You know, I was in Afghanistan on September 11th, and for sure, I mean, it was a little surreal. There was no television under the Taliban, so it was very surreal. There wasn't, for most ordinary Afghans, I don't say government people, but most ordinary, most of them understood that something horrible had happened because they heard it on the BBC. A lot of people died in America. They didn't understand the World Trade Center. You know, for a lot of Afghans, the idea of a building a mile high is just, I mean, you don't even have the mental vocabulary to understand it. So there really wasn't an understanding as such of what had happened, except that something horrible had happened, a lot of people had died, and there wasn't any celebrating in the streets in Kabul. People were very scared, people were very nervous. They understood very quickly that they would be at the center of it. You have to understand that Afghanistan, then as in now, then more so because you didn't even have the television or the images that the world was seeing and was seeing over and over again. You didn't have any of those images, first off, in Afghanistan at all. So it was all just what you could hear on the radio. And for most Afghans, really, there wasn't, I didn't find anybody that was celebrating you know, most people were sympathetic. So a lot of people were resigned too. You know, you have to understand Afghanistan at war for 20 years, and, you know, for sure they understand how horrible, but too, for them, a lot of them had been living with that kind of violence, and so while they felt sad, they thought, you know, there's a certain resignation. But so I think that really was the overwhelming sentiment in Afghanistan, was just they felt really sad about it, and most were afraid.
Thank you.
Yes?
You talked about it a little bit before. I was wondering if you could get a little bit more into the role of Zalmay Khalilzad, and if at all his being an Afghan American has any bearing on that. You see articles about his role in Afghanistan. Of course, he's moved on to Iraq since then, but his role in Afghanistan gave the impression, when you read about it, that he was running the place like a personal fiefdom, and I'm wondering if there's any truth to that impression, and also what his relationship with Hamid Karzai as well would be.
Well, there certainly was that impression that he was running it as his personal fiefdom. I don't know. The fact that he was Afghan American, I had an impact in so much as he was very actively involved in negotiations during the Loya Jirga. He was very active in the nitty-gritty political developments in Afghanistan that he might not be in Iraq. But he was very influential, not so much in running it as his own fiefdom, but of establishing a policy that was hugely detrimental and resulted in the squandering of many opportunities in terms of after the Taliban collapsed. They really had collapsed. I mean, they really had. The body was mortally wounded. There wasn't any, including ethnic Pashtuns, who weren't happy to see the back of them. But because of the policy of handing off Afghanistan to the Northern Alliance and to a very small minority, and actively marginalizing the ethnic Pashtuns, it created an environment that after 2 years, ethnic Pashtuns said, fine, you think I'm your enemy, I am your enemy. And that slowly breathed new life into the Taliban. And that really was a policy that Zalmay Khalilzad actively devised, and saw implemented in Afghanistan. Was very active. I mean, you know, Zalmay had he's very close to, he had the ear of the defense secretary. He still today has. He has ideas for how, any ideas for how the country should be run is not his idea alone. I mean, this is, he's getting it from the defense secretary, the defense secretary as well, his office. So, I mean, they're very, very closely working together. So, if Zalmay was alienating a certain group or marginalizing, he was not acting in a vacuum. What's his relationship? So, yes, he did run, he really called the shots because the U.S. was really calling the shots there. And they were poor policies. And what was his relations with Hamid Karzai? Zalmay knew Hamid before. They weren't good friends. I mean, they weren't close and allies at UNICAL or anything like that. But they did know each other. But it wasn't Zalmay Khalilzad who recommended Hamid Karzai for the job or anything like that. But certainly Zalmay had a very, very hands-on involvement in Afghanistan.
Thank you.
Hi, how are you?
Fine, thanks.
Osama bin Laden's a horrible man, and the Pakistanis shouldn't be harboring terrorists. But some would say that the biggest terrorist of them all is the beady-eyed little guy who's hardly ever in the Oval Office. And my question to you is, when do you think people will finally stand up and tell him to stop forcing ideals on people that might not want to hear what he has to say?
Well, here's a heck of a question. Well, you know, it's up to the American people. They elect them, you know. I mean, so I guess at the end of the day, it's up to him. You know, and really, I don't mean to be frivolous, because I don't think this is frivolous at all. But it really is, at the end of the day, up to the American people. And so people in other parts of the world often say that we should all have a chance to vote for the U.S. president because we're all affected by who is elected as U.S. president. However, that being said, we don't all have a vote. I'm Canadian, and so it is up to the American people. What can I say? Honestly, I'm not being frivolous at all.
All right, thanks.
I was wondering if you could describe the recent surge in poppy cultivation and the U.S. policy towards that.
Well, there certainly has been a surge. It's largely, the U.S. involvement in it has been that they have returned to power the very people who were some of the biggest drug dealers in Afghanistan's history, and continue to be some of the biggest dealers in drugs. So, in fact, Afghanistan, while people say it is becoming a narco-state, it is in fact a narco-state. It produces more opium than every other opium-producing country in the world combined. Most of it, however, goes to Europe. The U.S. does have a program to try and assist in the end of the poppy cultivation. That being said, it's spending a huge amount of money and clearing up very little of it. Do I think that it's actively involved in any of the dealings in the drugs? Not really. I mean, there was a suggestion during the Soviet invasion that the drugs, the opium that was produced and was being sold was with the connivance of the U.S. Because it helped to fund that war against the Soviet Union, and that might have been true. I don't think there's any active connivance of the U.S. administration in the drug trade in Afghanistan, other than putting the very people in power who were actively involved in it in the first place.